this is happening. If anyone's out there, let us know you're out there. We're trying a couple of things out here, so this is the test episode. Got one like. Someone's watching. We're going to see if somebody shows up here. Thanks for joining us.
Mogi, don't fall asleep. We got one person.
I don't think you can see us yet. I think the camera's coming up now. Let's try that. That should bring us online. All right, here we go. So, let's turn down this mess right here. Welcome to the Voltage Control Lab live stream. This is our first live stream. We're testing some things out, and this is going to be a hot mess, I'm sure. My name is Joe from Voltage Control Lab. You might recognize my voice from some of the videos if you've watched some of our videos. And behind me over here is Victor Carrillo. He's the creative director of Voltage Control Lab and has been with us and helping us out since the very beginning of the project here. So this is going to be our show. We also have Mogi back here, right here, sitting on the couch. So, yeah, here we are. Please forgive the loose nature of today's show because this is sort of our trial and error episode. I've done live streaming before. Maybe you've caught those as well, and they were kind of messy in and of themselves. If you notice anything weird, please let us know in the comments. If you notice any weird lag between the what's on screen and the audio. If you have any suggestions, we'd love to hear suggestions because this is in the growing stages, and we want this to be kind of a collaborative community effort. And yeah, any thoughts on starting this thing up, Victor?
Well, I think testing out everything and the software and all that's probably the smartest move.
Yeah, we'll see. What other things kind of succeed and fail in this test. We're going to keep growing this process. This is, a work in progress generally. So we've got a few shows and guests lined up in the next few weeks. Our good friend Encanti is coming in from Valencia, Spain, where he teaches at Berkeley, Valencia. And he's going to be joining us when he comes to LA to play with Mr. Bill in a couple of weeks. And we've got a bunch of other people that we're lining up, hopefully. So we'll be working that out. You will be seeing more patch cables. We can switch over there. This is where we're going to be going very shortly. We're going to look at the darkest timeline. But this is going to be a multi-faceted, multi-format show, including discussion of modular-related news. Audio is very low. Okay, thank you for that input. Let's get the audio up. Better now? Let me know as we go. And let's see. Any better? I think we're getting there a little bit better now. Okay. So, Victor, got any modular related news to discuss?
I'm still just on the crazy news, so I'll be moving into modular news soon. But you know how it is these days. I have to crawl into the volcano of news to find it.
Gotcha.
And,
Gotcha.
Yeah, almost.
Mogi is getting bored in the background. Okay, well, any topics of suggestion from the audience? Any modular news? Any modules that you'd like us to take a look at and discuss? Of course, we're going to have to look at those things for the most part on the internet. We're talking about new modules, new announcements, anything like that. If not, we're going to get right into some darkest timeline.
Ha.
5 out of 5 for you? Meaning 5 out of 5 what? I wonder. All right. Well, it's a coffee morning here. Okay. TMI, but somebody is excited about getting into Ornament and Crime. So maybe we'd better do that. This is going to be an ongoing series, I can only assume, because the Ornament and Crime is a deep, multifaceted thing. Okay, 5 out of 5 for audio quality, fantastic. Let us know if it gets too loud, if anything goes awry otherwise. So let's talk about the Ornament and Crime. Anyone here have the Ornament and Crime? Raise your hand in the chat room if you have the Ornament and Crime. We'll give you a second to do that. And while we're at it, we're going to move over to the... Shackmat. I have to say I'm a big fan of their modules. I do not have any, unfortunately, but they are really sick. I really love their, what is it, the Bishop's Miscellany? Is that the one? I think that's the name of it. Something weird and funky like that. What's up, Marco? We see you there. Yeah, the Shackmat modules always impress as far as I'm concerned. I think they're pretty cool. Marco, why so sad? Give us some smiley faces. Renee team over here, I'm down for that. Are you on Renee 2? A lot of new features in the Renee 2. I'm still on the Renee 1. Still loving this thing. I think they're pieces of art just as much as their instruments. All right, we got a thumbs up from Marco. Thank goodness. I was worried about you, Marco. All right, we've got another cat coming into the studio right now. So, why don't we take a look at the Ornament and Crime? The Ornament and Crime is one of my favorite modules. If it's no Ornament and Crime, that'll make you sad. I understand. Maybe we'll convince you today. So, the Ornament and Crime, such a deep module. This was a module that was a collaboration between a number of different makers. It's an open source module. It's really deep. I think it has 12 or 13 different modes in the original firmware. And there are now additional firmwares, one of those being the Hemisphere Suite. And this device, this firmware for this hardware is it's pretty deep. We've got a lot of modes that we can run concurrently, kind of side by side, almost like we're running 2 Ornament and Crimes. We've got these kind of dual pairing modes where we can have, say, an envelope on one side, an LFO on another side, or much weirder stuff than that. It can be a very hard module to start to wrap your head around, and I think it's really important to check out one mode at a time. And once you get into Hemisphere Suite, then we get into like a whole other set of things. The Hemisphere Suite might ironically be an easier one to get your head around because the modes are a little bit more straightforward in their functionality. And Samuel, if you want to see some videos on the Ornament and Crime, you should check out the other videos on my channel, we've got like probably like 12 to 15 videos about Ornament and Crime on there, and some of my best performing videos, I have to say. It's a very unique and popular device, but partially because it's so deep and there's so much to it to understand. So it's something that you do have to take some time and dive into. So once we get into Hemisphere Suite, there's a number of additional modes. It's an alternative firmware to the original firmware that was designed by Timmy Churches and crew. So there are a couple of modes in the Hemisphere Suite that are not dual modes. And one of those is the Darkest Timeline, which is a pretty cool mode within the Ornament and Crime. Probably the coolest part about it, in my opinion, is the fact that it can be used as a CV recorder, a sort of sample and hold looper. So we can record a sequence into it from another source, or we could even, in a sense, step record from it from like a keyboard, a CV gate keyboard, which maybe we'll look at in another week. But we can record sequences into this thing, and then we can manipulate those sequences in interesting ways. Now, it has a lot of additional functionality just in this one mode, including MIDI input and output. And that MIDI input and output requires us to have the teensy controller that drives the whole device, which is a programmable open source controller, kind of like the Arduino, but really focused towards audio. And we can use this thing to send MIDI back and forth from our computer. Now, we're not going to do that because my particular device has the teensy inside of the device, right, like behind the panel, and so that's not going to be very easy to access for MIDI use. But it's something that you could do, and especially if you got, say, a modded version of the Ornament and Crime with front panel access to the teensy, or if you had access, to a hole in your panel or a few empty HP between modules, then you could route, a USB micro cable out to your computer and have computer to modular USB to MIDI functionality, to see USB MIDI to CV, basically. But that's another deeper mode simply within the Darkest Timeline. So basically we can record up to 32 step sequences, and then we can take those sequences and we can tweak them. We can send portions of those sequences out to another output as what they call the alternative, or the alternate timeline, I should say. This is where the Darkest Timeline starts to come in. And then we can record probability-based CV that fire gates, or rather triggers, I should say, from the additional outputs. So let's come over here and check this thing out. I'm going to have to rearrange my seat. Okay. So, sorry about the microphone noise. This is, again, something that we're going to work to improve. Getting good at muting microphones when it's convenient. Okay. Here we go. So, what do we have set up here? The Darkest Timeline, first step is we're going to record some CV into a sequence. And I'm using the voltage block for this. Now, I've got a clock going into trigger 1 input. That clock is sending the same clock, should be. Let's get this thing going here. Now I broke it. Okay. So now we should be getting trying to get this pulsar to send the same clock. Okay, now it should be going, I think. No? Okay, we'll try another output. There we go. All right, so we're sending the same tempo information from pulsar to the voltage block to do our sequencing. Doesn't really matter. We don't really even need a clock going to the voltage block. We really just need a clock going to give us a sequence tempo over here. And then we've got the channel 1 output from the voltage block, a CV source, effectively, going to the CV1 input. That's going to be our recording input. So a clock to trigger 1, or a gate or trigger, basically. CV source going into the CV1. The output A is then going to an oscillator to play back the pattern, and we can hear that right there, hopefully. There are Eurorack preamps. If you go on modular grid, there's a whole number of them, depending on what you need. If you need microphone preamps, if you need line inputs, things like this. These are all available, and you could even go with a complicated signal chain. Just answering Marco in the comments here. You could get like a proper signal chain for signal processing, something from the studio, and or for the studio, I should say, and then send that through one of these preamps. So, okay, and we'll hopefully do that without this dull tone running behind us. Okay, so we've got a tone. And now I'm hitting the camera. Okay, there we go. So, nothing recorded into the darkest timeline yet. Now, as I start to change the voltage block setting, we're not really going to hear anything. We're not going to see any change until we trigger recording, hitting button 1, the up button. No drums. No drums yet. Okay, so now we're recording. We're recording an 8-step sequence. If I want to change the sequence length, then I can move knob 1, the left-hand knob. Let's do a 16-step sequence. And now it's recording our input. We can see that flashing column on the far left. And here I can zoom in there. There we go. And now as I move the channel 1 slider on voltage block, hit button 1 again to stop recording, and it loops that sample and held sequence. If we want to erase it, we can hold the down button. When we release the down button, it will erase. We'll record another sequence. Okay. Now, I don't have anything gating this signal right now. We're just hearing the note sequence coming out. So, if we mix in another channel, we can send the output from the B channel. Okay, it's down here, this blue cable coming out of channel B. That's going to go to the input on another oscillator. Okay, we're going to hear that oscillator playing basically just its flattened, tuned tone. Now, as I turn the step number down, okay, we're going to take this 16-step sequence and we're going to turn it into an 8-step sequence. The other 8 steps after this index point, you can see this dotted line. That's the beginning of our sequence. The 8 steps from 9 to 16 are going to start being sent from output B to our other oscillator. Okay, so we're going to start to hear, and really as we go down from 16 steps, we're going to start to hear the leftover step or steps sent to output B, and we're going to get these overlapping patterns. So this is a quick way to get these overlapping related patterns, especially if we send some sort of quantized CV signal into the CV1 to record to begin with. So let's listen to our original signal again. And here comes the second signal, which sounds out of tune right now because it's not really being detuned yet to the scale or to the sequence. And now I'll change the step number. We can always mix out one or both of those channels. So we're really dealing with a CV recorder at the core of this thing, right? We're dealing with that that trigger one being our clock source, kind of doing our sample and hold triggering, right? The input on CV1, that's that CV signal, right? That could not necessarily just be voltage block, right? We could send that like an LFO or something like this, and it's going to catch it every 16th note or whatever tempo we're sending for trigger one. So maybe we could try that. I'm going to erase the pattern. We'll unpatch, excuse the rustling here. We'll unpatch from voltage block and we'll go from, I use the quad LFO here. Okay, now again to record, let's see, let's make sure we have some level coming out of this LFO. We do. Okay, so to record, we just hit this input. Maybe we'll slow down the speed here. There it goes. And let's listen to it. Okay, now we might want to transpose this. So we can send a signal into CV4. Let's do that. 0 to 5 volts will transpose, but or actually we could send negative voltage, but actually the voltage source I'm using here does not send negative voltage. So we're not going to use that to do transposing. We might actually just re-record at a lower frequency. right now it's in a low, it's probably in a negative voltage right now. All right, so you see what it did to that rising and falling sine wave, right? We're just working with really a half of that sine wave, the rising positive voltage. And the negative voltage, you might have noticed, there was no signal. We trigger it at a certain frequency, this, whatever tempo this is, 16th note tempo, and it's freezing that sine wave, that slow rising and falling sine wave at certain voltages. So we end up with this thing. And we could transpose that whole thing, I suppose. But that's a little bit extreme. So another option we could do is maybe change the level of our LFO. So we changed the amplitude effectively of the LFO here, giving us a smaller rise and fall. Manuel, sorry if I mispronounced that. This is the Hemisphere Suite alternative update, or rather alternative firmware for Ornament and Crime. So you can update your Teensy on the back of your Ornament and Crime and install the firmware with this particular device inside of it, this particular mode. Okay, so we've got this now 16-step sequence of a rising and falling LFO, a sampled and held LFO, right? So let's take that, and if we change our timeline pattern length here, so we now end up with an 11-step pattern. The first of those 11 steps that we just recorded sent to our first oscillator, output A, and the remaining 5 steps have been sent to output B, to a second oscillator, which you can hear play the 5 steps from the end of our original pattern, our original 16-step pattern. It plays them at the end of now an 11-step pattern. It's kind of an odd kind of relationship here that's forming between these two sequences. And this is kind of the name, where the name comes from, the darkest timeline. Could go back up to 16, and then we'll only hear our first oscillator playing that sequence. The second oscillator is playing effectively nothing. Now we could expand this to a 32-step sequence. Now if we hold the left encoder, we can also just create a fully randomized pattern. Maybe a little bit too chaotic for us. So we're going to record 32 steps now. Okay, now notice the incoming signal is passed a lot faster than that 16th note sequence out through output C, or output A, sorry. But then when it's frozen, we get this nice stepped result. This might be a quirk in the firmware. It might be something that's just a just a standard unpreventable occurrence with the Ornament and Crime or with this particular suite, but something that we might notice in the process. So now we've got a 32-step sequence. Let's take it down to 16 steps. So the last 16 steps now will be sent to our second oscillator out of output B. trying to give you a little bit better picture there, but we're having to zoom way in on this tiny little screen. Okay, if we go fewer notes or fewer steps, then however many more steps beyond 8 plus 8 steps are going to be cut off from the end of the sequence. So at this point, we're going to have the first 12 steps, the second 12 steps, and then the last, 8 steps will be dropped from the sequence. Okay, now we can also use the right channel, the right encoder, to change the index, to change the start point of the sequence. So if we go back out to our 32 steps, we can see it's starting right now on that pair, right? So if we change the right encoder settings, if we turn that knob, it will offset that sequence. So if this were clocked with another beat, something like that, then the timing would be offset by 1 or more 16th notes, 1 or more divisions of time. We can also perform that offset by sending a CV signal into CV3 input. And coming back to 0 gives us back that original index. Okay, actually, we have to press, the right-hand encoder to get the index editing. Otherwise, we're just scrubbing, right? Index stays the same. If we push the index, you can see that index point blinks. We can move it back to the beginning there, right? So this is index editing on by turning on the right encoder. And then we can scrub through and find a different place for that flashing line. Push it again, that locks it in place, and then we're just scrubbing. Okay. Now, of course, this is using this thing as the second sequence as a pitch sequence. We don't have to use it for that purpose. We could send it to some other modulating source, right? Here's our original signal, sequence coming out of output A. Output B, the darker timeline, the alternative timeline, is going now to modulate the FM amount on our oscillator. I'm using braids at the moment. So this is modulating the timbre function on braids feedback FM mode. Maybe not as interesting musical results in this particular arrangement, but especially I think for those competing musical patterns with two oscillators, we can get some really interesting results. Now, this is all working with the upper timeline here, right? It doesn't have to be. We don't have to be relegated to only this upper timeline. However, when we start including the lower timeline, we start getting into, rather than CV signal that's being sent, we start getting into using probability-based triggers. Okay, so imagine this. From output C and D, we're going to have not CV being sent like we kind of usually will have, but instead we're going to have triggers. Okay, I believe a 0 to 5 volt trigger. I couldn't tell you the length of that trigger, but it's probably something like 5 or 10 milliseconds. So CV outputs C and D on the Ornament and Crime are not going to send CV, right? They're not going to send either of our A or B main or alternative timeline outputs, the normal or parallel universes, as they call them. We're instead going to be using a normal and parallel universe for triggers. And the bottom sequence that we're going to see, right, not this top one, but the bottom one here, is going to be one of probability based triggering. Okay, so as we see those signals go from 0, or those sliders rise and fall, those will be probability values between 0 and 100%, right? This isn't a 0 to 5 volt CV sequence like we have from A and B. Instead, it's a 0 to 100% probability that a trigger will be sent on that step from output C. Okay, now output D, how does that work? Well, that will give us the inverse probability. So if output C on a certain step has a value of 100% and sends a trigger no matter what, then output D will have the opposite 0% probability of sending a trigger and output nothing. Okay? If output C has a 50% chance to trigger, then output D will have a 50% chance to trigger. Again, that doesn't mean that either or both of them will trigger, right? It just means that they have a chance to trigger or send a trigger ultimately. So that means that we need to figure out a way to employ those triggers. Okay, now we can send a CV signal into that channel by using CV channel 2. The CV input 2. So we're going to send our LFO into that channel right now. We'll turn off the recording. Okay, we've got an LFO going to that. Maybe I'll change the shape of that LFO and the frequency. Okay, so we'll see what this gives us. Now, we're going to record this. We need to route some triggers out. So let's do that. Let's see, we're going to try and take one of these triggers and we're going to send it up to basically just pluck our okay, so this is going to basically pluck the braids, which I'm sending through ripples. See if we can get this to work. Turn down that, turn this up. Okay, that's not very thrilling. Let's send it actually into an envelope first. That would probably make a lot more sense, wouldn't it? So now we're going to trigger an envelope, which is going to open and close. There we go. Okay. So let's first try to give ourselves like a nice 100% sequence. So I'm just going to send in okay, so we're just recording 16 steps right now. Let's take it down to 16 steps. That'll make it a little easier. Okay. So we've got a 16-step sequence going to trigger that that pattern that we were using before. I'm going to route operator, or sorry, not operator, output D to trigger the Bacillus iteratus. Choose your poison. Route that out to the sequencer. So this is now going to be triggered. Kind of, it's not going to be triggered inverse to the other, but the probability that it will be triggered, that percentage chance that it will be triggered, is going to be opposite the chance that our braids oscillator will be triggered. So let's hear if we can get this thing to work. Now, the only way that we can do that, right? Now we're not getting any triggers whatsoever, unless we're on the off chance we have something less than 100% recorded into our probability timeline. So let's record a more even-handed timeline. And there it is. And let's hear our first one. And you know, while we're at it, let's take this output B, right? The alternative timeline, the parallel universe from our musical sequence. Let's send that into the pitch CV input on the Bacillus. That might be interesting. And maybe we'll record something a little bit more interesting on the probability timeline. All right. Right, we can start modulating other things. Maybe we send an LFO to that attack time. Maybe an LFO to our modulation. Right, so once we get that thing going, some pretty interesting, pretty exciting action happening. And we could even, you know, unplug everything, clear everything. Right, just having turn off our, unplug our LFO sources here. Right. Just from that, we can start up. And notice that the Bacillus is triggering 100% of the time now because the timeline, probability timeline is set to 0, right? So if we, what is it? We hold the left encoder, It's going to create a random pattern on both channels for us, both sequences. It's a little extreme, but okay. So one other thing to mention here is that if we press the left encoder, we're going to get access to all of the quantization settings that go along with the Ornament and Crime. This is also where we'll set up any of these MIDI output settings that we might want to use to employ the internal MIDI device that's built into. Oh, I guess we should probably turn this back down here. That would probably help. There we go. So I pressed the left encoder, and wish there was an easier way to do this, but we have to tab through each one of these. With the scale function, I can set, there are all the modes, right? If we're looking for major scales, we can use Ionian. If we're looking for minor scales, natural minor scales, we can use Aeolian. And we have the other modes as well. We have blues scales, pentatonic scales, and then all the rest of the world and math-based scales that we get out of Ornament and Crime, and maybe even more that come with Hemisphere Suite. I haven't really pushed the boundaries there, but some very interesting stuff here that we can kind of build into the process. We can even create our own scales or turn that all off. So, we can very quickly get into a certain scale. If our oscillator is tuned to a certain, to a proper pitch, then, a relative pitch, then we can set our actual root note as well. And then we set like MIDI output channels, output the alternate universe, alternate pattern MIDI channel, and then any input MIDI information that we might use. Again, we might go over that some other time, but how much do we want to use MIDI through this device? I don't know. Okay, so hopefully that was a weird camera angle. I was just giving a momentary glance at the rest of the patch. Hopefully this one makes more sense. But okay, so now we've got this thing hopefully a little bit going with it. We can even come back here, maybe erase these patterns, and maybe patch something back in. Let's first record a nice full probability pattern so we can hear our main oscillator. Okay, and there we go. It should be good. Oops, gotta keep recording. Gotta keep recording. Always be recording. Okay, now we'll turn off the recording, and now maybe I'll patch this into CV1, and we'll record there. And maybe we'll record a little bit less extreme here. And it would also help if we turned on that oscillator. Okay, now if we come over here and change the scale, right, these are different modes, so we're really just shifting scale tones up or down by semitones. Semi mode gives us a chromatic scale. We could turn it off and get maybe more microtonal results, depending on whether our oscillator is in a quantized mode or whether we're sending the output of the darkest timeline through another quantizer. But hopefully this would show us that we don't need another quantizer. We can just use the one that's built in. We can ignore all the rest of these functions. Now we're right back in here. And maybe now we start to create a new pattern for our probability timeline. maybe shorten our pattern. Would really help if both of these things were tuned. So maybe a little bit better. I did turn the scale back on, right? I think that's about as close as they're going to get. I think I need to recalibrate some of my oscillators. But, you know, we're trying to, again, kind of like come back to the basic functionality here that we can use just really a CV input, or rather a trigger, a clock input, to give ourselves a tempo. Let's tab through back over here. Record in a CV signal, right? But I hear you, Noise Bleeder. I think the Ornament and Crime is certainly a device for certain uses. And, you know, the nice thing I think about the Ornament and Crime is that you don't really ever have to look at the menus once you set it up the way that you want. Like right now, we don't really ever have to dive through any menus. That's the nice thing about this particular mode in particular, specifically, right? Like the whole point of this mode is that there's really only one menu. That's it. It's really for just setting your scale and setting up MIDI stuff, which, you know, if you already have some sort of computer to modular device, should you want that, you probably don't need that anyway. But here now we can just, you know, kind of work with this thing as is. We just need those buttons and some sort of CV source. We can record. Okay. Triggering that one now. Triggering, controlling the wrong envelope a minute ago. That would explain it. We can send a CV signal into either 1 or 2. We can hit record on either one of those channels, channel 1, channel 2. However many steps we set, that's how many steps will get recorded. Just like a sample and hold. And, you know, I don't know why I just don't have 2 channels set into these 2 separate inputs. That would make this whole thing a little bit more easy. And then so, you know, this mode in particular, you don't need to do any menu diving really, especially if you don't want a scale-based results, right? Especially if we don't want to engage the built-in quantizer. But imagine that's a lot of functions in one device, right? A probability-based trigger, really two channels of it, because we get this kind of like weird interplay between the normal and the inverted probability outputs with outputs C and D. We get a sequencer, up to 32-step sequencer, not just a sequencer that's able to record CV inputs, right? We can actually loop and record CV signals, just like a sample and hold, maybe. It's really a sample and hold and loop, I suppose. And then we get that thing, which we can manipulate and send to multiple channels and get these kind of weird alternate parallel universe sequences out of outputs B, output B. As we change the length of that sequence, just using the left-hand knob here, the leftover recorded steps go to that output B, and we get these weird overlapping results. As far as menu diving, I think my preferred use of Ornament and Crime is to find the mode that you like, right? Menu diving maybe in preparation mode, but then you find that thing, which can itself probably do a million things, especially with some modulation, with a little bit of setup. All of a sudden, you've got something that could maybe do like, a lot of stuff inside of your rack for relatively little space and money. That's why I've been obsessed with this module for so long. With the Hemisphere Suite, it really just explodes the whole functionality again. Like, it was already just an amazing module. The biggest hurdle, I think, with it before in the original firmware is probably the naming conventions of the different modes. But this is not meant to be kind of a normal module. It's meant to be a little bit different. Its name would suggest that it's meant to be a little bit more precious, I think, than the normal multi-mode module, and take from that what you will. But yeah, I mean, for the cost of this thing, you can get some. This is a kind of a large version of it as well. This is from the early iterations of the Ornament and Crime. They have micro versions of it now, or U, O, and C, or whatever they call them. And I've even seen like a 1U version of it, which there's now some mods that have like voltage attenuation and offset and things like this. So lots of stuff that you can do with this thing, and something to start exploring. Okay, just rearranging now. So I think capping off that discussion, let's just say, please, if you guys have any requests, if you guys have anything that you'd like us to discuss in the future, any modes, any modules, I mean, I can only do what we can do in terms of like getting modules that people want us to cover, obviously for cost reasons. But if you have requests, if you have suggestions, if you have ideas about our format, if you want to help us wake up Mogi here, who is asleep at the wheel. She's supposed to be supervising this show right now, and she's acting kind of lazy. Wonder if we can get this thing to like zoom in on her. This is the type of thing I need to get a lot faster with. Whoa. There she is. That's Mogi. If you guys saw our video a while back about, oh, there we go. Okay. If you guys saw our video a while back about getting our workspace, what was at the time we were hoping to become our school space. Didn't work out. We're still in that same space, but for complex reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, maybe we'll cover that in another episode. It didn't end up being a school space. It's turned out to be more of a studio space. But yeah, Mogi was one of the cats who was living out back of our space, and we adopted her and her two sons. Now they live within this studio space, and so we'll hopefully see them quite a bit in the show. We're going to try to give them more enticements in the future. If you have any recommendations on how to entice our cats into the studio while we're broadcasting, we're all ears to that. Yeah. Okay, Q&A. Who's got questions? Who's got answers? Who's got problems, complaints, comments, peanut gallery style insults? Let's keep those to a minimum, but yeah. Let's see if we get any requests here. Any questions about new modules? Any questions about old modules? Throw them out at us. Let's hear your problems. I'm just going to do this until I get a Q&A. Some sort of Q to A. Anyone getting sick yet? Any modular news?
Didn't really see any modular news.
Well, we had the Behringer Poly D.
Yeah,
that we this week. Synth news. The Poly D, the Para D, which probably doesn't sound nearly as good. Just saying it out loud now. The actually paraphonic Behringer synthesizer, right, which was supposed to be it's an alteration of their Moog Model D. It's clone. I don't want to get myself into trouble now. I don't need to get sued. It was their testament to their tribute to one of the synth classics. Maybe that's the safe way to put it. They made a second version of it, right? It was a very popular device, still I'm sure is. But the new Poly D, not Poly D, but the Poly D is actually paraphonic. People are noting from the demo videos. So that means that we don't get true polyphony from that device. And I think any company on the verge of naming something that sounds like parody might not be good business idea. Maybe it'd be the perfect business idea. Let us know in the comments. Behringer should make some powered cases. Now, there's a subject to discuss. Have you guys seen the imminently moddable Nifty modular cases? Let's see if I can find this. This is made by an LA-based module. I believe they're LA-based. They have Henry Strange doing some of their promotion. Let's see if we can bring this up. We go to this mode. Hey, we're still here. Mogi is still asleep on the couch. And now we can look at, oh, not that. This, the Nifty case. I don't know these guys. I know Henry Strange, who did a video for them, and he's a genius. Really wonderful guy, really nice guy. He made his own module recently, which is an LED driving module. Oh, we're dropping some frames now. Um, uh, the his company is Strange Electronics, and it's CV to RGB. So you can send CV signals to control like an LED light strip. Like you can't really see it in the light, but I've got one in the back of the room. So that's a cool thing. But Henry was recently promoting this device made by I think a friend of his, and they've got two modules coming out as well. This cell module, which is like a sequencer controller, and a basically I think it's a 3 oscillator chips. Here we go. Each VCO, a dual VCO and LFO. So it's got 2 VCOs and an LFO built in that you can route around inside of it or elsewhere. You can see it's got these kind of basic wave shapes, and it's a pretty good price, I have to say. But the device here, the case has a nice like empty open shell at the top of it. So if you wanted to do some modifying of this case, say build a mult, a passive mult into this thing, right? You could even access the power strip, I'm sure, and built in a powered mult if you would like, or output audio attenuators. It's I believe like some sort of plexiglass or plastic shell, so you could easily drill through that with the right drill bit, I'm sure. And maybe it's not even plexiglass, maybe it's thinner than that. But somebody was basically sending a camera down inside of this thing, not that complicated of a thing, but it's we've got all of this area across this panel to modify, or really across the back as well, I'm sure. So if you're looking for an inexpensive but maybe modifiable case, this might be an option, and provides pretty good power, especially if you're working with digital modules. Yeah, so just thinking of that. What else? Get this thing working. There we go. So, what else? Uh-oh, error. All right, well, we're getting errors now, so maybe we better wrap it up. But any final words?
Well, I thought this went pretty good for the first time.
Yeah, I think we're building this thing. We're really like, this is really our trial and error version. I think we're going to try to not have quite as much, not try to put 45 minutes on the modular. Try to maybe limit that to shorter amount of time in the future. But we're also going to hopefully have guests, people to break this up and give us something else to talk about other than esoteric module modes that might blow some people off. I don't know. We'll see what comes up. Give us your suggestions. Tweet us at voltage. No, wait. Tweet us at V Control Lab. Okay. On Instagram, we're at Voltage Control Lab. We also actually just put out some music with our colleague Dave Haro, who's another modular fanatic, another extremely talented producer, and a friend of ours. The artist or the group name is The Blessed Oscillator. So if you look us up on Spotify or Bandcamp or whatever, you should be able to find us. So yeah. Next week we're going to be back on Saturday, probably at 11 o'clock. We're going to make an announcement. This show is going to be pretty regular. We're going to try to do it every week, but the time might change. So if you really want to keep up to date, subscribe on the YouTube channel. Hit the bell, as they say. That'll give you the updates as they come. When we start to stream, you should get like a notification or something like that. I don't know why you'd want that. It sounds very annoying, but to your life. Okay, so
All right.
thank you guys very much.
Peace.
We'll see you guys next time, and have a great day.